order. We're now sitting in public again, and the proceedings are being broadcast. Before we start hearing from the witnesses, do any members wish to make a declaration of interest in connection with the bill? No? Yes? Bob Blackman.
I chair your party parliamentary group for Action on Smoking Health.
Thank you. Bambos Charalambos.
It's an action declaration. I did the Cancer Research 10k fund run in February, the winter run, so I don't know if that's...
That's more of a boast than a declaration of interest. Dr. Johnson.
I'm an NHS consultant paediatrician and a member of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health.
Sorry, I can't say. Oh yeah, Dr. Lisa Cameron. My eyesight's failing me.
So I'm a practicing psychologist and I also chair the All-Party Health Group.
Mary Glinden.
Do we have to declare our membership of any group? I'm a member of the APPG for responsible vaping.
Well, whether it was required or not, you've done so. Yes. We'll now hear oral evidence from Michelle Mitchell, Chief Executive of Cancer Research UK, Deborah Arnott, Chief Executive of Action on Smoking and Health, and Sheila Duffy, Chief Executive of Action on Smoking and Health, Scotland. Can I call on, to begin with, Michelle Mitchell?
Do you want me to start?
Yes.
I mean, first thing, thank you for your openness and transparency, Chair. I think it's also important to declare, if anybody's giving evidence today, their associations with the tobacco industry, and I have none. So, you know, the principle of accountability and transparency also is important for people giving evidence. So just initially, smoking is the biggest cause of death, ill health, and disability. It's the biggest cause of cancer in the UK. It has a huge impact on preventable deaths, the economy, productivity, and of course families and loved ones. Cancer Research UK supports the legislation to create the first ever smoke-free generation and to stop young people developing addictions, risk, ill health, and of course cancer. We believe that the rights and entitlements of current smokers are reasonably unaffected, and that we urge you in your considerations in Parliament to pass the legislation, and the public, 73% of whom support the legislation.
Thank you. Can I, you may wish to just initially introduce yourself if you wish, or go on into making a presentation. I'm open-minded about that. So can I call on Deborah Arnott?
Thank you, Chair. My name's Deborah Arnott. I'm Chief Executive of Action on Smoking and Health, a position I've held since May 2003, so this is my 21st year. And I've been around for a lot of tobacco legislation, and it is really impressive to see where successive governments have brought us to. I think that, I don't know whether you want me to go on and make some key points. Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Okay, well, I think one thing I'd say is people have said, well, why do we need this? Smoking rates are going down. Well, the evidence is clear. If you take the foot off the pedal, smoking rates don't continue to fall. We've seen that around the world, and in recent years we're seeing that in the UK too. Indeed, our 2024 survey of 11 to 17-year-olds found that smoking rates have pretty much flatlined since before COVID. And the UCL Smoking Toolkit study is finding the same thing with adults, and in particular with young adults. So the smoke-free generation policy is vital to make smoking obsolete. That's the government's ambition, and I think it's one everyone here shares. I can provide you with the full youth and adult survey data, but we're still working on the detailed analysis. I was asked whether I could also talk a bit about the surveys we've done of retailers. So we have published some of the data, and some of this data is in addition. Now, for many years, tobacco industry-funded trade bodies have campaigned against successive legislation, against tax increases, against the display ban, and against plain packaging. So ASH wanted to find out what retailers themselves think, and we commissioned NEMS Market Research to survey representative samples of managers or owners of independent shops selling tobacco, because it's particularly important to understand what our small shopkeepers experience, because they're the ones who have most difficulty implementing legislation potentially. The latest survey was conducted in January and early February, and it was over 900 retailers in England and Wales, and showed that more than half, 51%, support raising the age of sale every year, with only a quarter opposing. 79% support fixed penalty notices for breaches of age of sale regulations, which are in the legislation, and 13% oppose. And 71% support mandatory age verification, with only 1 in 5 opposing. Now, that last point I think is really important. The legislation actually does include mandatory age verification for Scotland, but not for the remaining nations of the United Kingdom. Why is that important? Because it's a level playing field. It means that anyone going in to purchase tobacco knows whichever shop they go into, they'll be treated the same. That makes it easier for retailers and for customers. And I think also from my experience of the smoke-free laws, because I was here when that was being debated and when there was a lot of opposition from the tobacco industry saying it would be unenforceable, you couldn't stop people smoking in public places. And if you think about it, raising the age of sale 1 year every year is a very incremental measure. Banning smoking in public places, particularly in clubs and clubs, those of you who are old enough will remember just how smoky those places were, was a much more dramatic change. But actually, what we saw was in England, in the 8 months after the legislation was implemented, there was 98% compliance. Why? Because it was popular, just as this legislation is, but also because it was underpinned by a good communication strategy, clear signage in premises, and guidance to business. And that's what we need to see for this legislation. And if we have that, I don't think there will be difficulties in enforcing the legislation. And clearly that's what retailers think too.
Thank you. Finally, can I call on Sheila Duffy? Can I, unnecessary though it may seem, can I ask each of the, when we conclude, well, you can do it now, but the other two colleagues later. For the record, if you could state your name and title. Carry on.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Sheila Duffy. I'm the Chief Executive of ASH Scotland, which is one of 4 ASH organisations within the UK. I welcome and we welcome very much this proposed legislation. These are strong measures, they are necessary measures. Tobacco is the most addictive, lethal substance openly on sale, and these will incrementally clear tobacco from the shelves. But it's a long-term measure. It's not, you can't just do one thing with tobacco. We know that. You have to have a strategic, comprehensive programme of measures. And in Scotland, where circumstances are different in some respects, for example, our cessation services are in health boards, we have a register for tobacco and vaping products, we have fines for underage sales. We are particularly concerned about the huge rise in youth vaping, which has been driven particularly by the promotion and easy availability of cheap, brightly coloured, sweet-flavoured e-cigarettes. Moves are being made in Scotland, and I hope not derailed by recent political changes, to end the sale of single-use disposable vapes. But we need to do more to create an environment that drives health for the next generation. So Scotland committed to creating a generation free from tobacco in 2013. Our end game target's 2034. And I would urge you to introduce the strongest possible measures and close loopholes, and resist the arguments and blandishments of multinational corporate industries whose interest is profit, not the health of your constituents.
Thank you. I now intend to take 2 questions each from the opposition spokesperson and the minister. Given that we've got very restricted time, I would impress upon the witnesses that they need to be very brief in their answers. Cargill.
Thank you, Chair. You will have seen at second reading, I think there's almost universal agreement that on the basic point that smoking is bad, and of course we want to see smoking rates come down and have a smoke-free future. There was a lot of members of Parliament that raised other issues, especially around raising the age of sale. So can you explain why you support the complete ban as the right way to deliver a smoke-free future?
Do you want to ask, is that just, you're going to have just one question, or do you want to put 2?
Do you want me to ask the second one as well now?
Pardon?
You want me to ask the second one now as well?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay. I suppose it's to the point that Sheila sort of raised. I mean, Clause 61 gives the Secretary of State powers to regulate around packaging, vaping or nicotine products, and Clause 62 makes regulations for the Secretary of State to have powers about substances that may be included and the flavour of vaping. Do you believe the measures in the bill to prevent vapes appealing to children are likely to work, and where can we learn lessons to ensure their effectiveness?
Minister.
You want me to ask two questions now? Okay. Could you please talk us through Ash's assessment of the economic costs to the UK economy of smoking? And secondly, what's your view on the importance of restricting vaping for children? Thank you.
Thanks. Can I start with Sheila Duffy, please?
Thank you. In terms of a complete ban, you're talking about a ban on retail distribution of tobacco, and the hope is it will put it out of sight and out of fashion for the generation growing up. My preference is always to look at the product and the industry rather than the consumer. So I think we need to maintain other issues like good fiscal policy, high price and tax. In terms of packaging and flavours, we know that the tobacco industry sold the sizzle on tobacco. It sold the image, it sold how it made people feel, and it sold the very short-term felt attractions and benefits. So in the 1950s, people were being recommended to smoke for appearing glamorous, appearing rugged and confident, for clearing their chests in TB hospitals. And we didn't know at that time how devastatingly harmful it was to health and how many years of life it would rob people of. We must learn the lessons. It is the sizzle, it's the packaging, the marketing, the promotions that we must get on top of with vaping products, because that has driven the interest among young people and the exponential, doubling, tripling of regular use among children that weren't smoking. And there is a link between regular vaping and moving on to smoking, which I can send you the evidence for. In terms of the economic costs, the World Bank looked at this years ago. Tobacco is not good value for any economy because the long-term costs are huge. And what you're talking about is privatising the profit, but socialising the costs. And it's a huge burden on the NHS and a huge burden on people's lives. This is undermining their health and the health of their families. And the final question was the importance of restricting e-cigarettes for children. Well, let's learn the lessons from tobacco, and let's actually take some strong steps to stop the next generation becoming addicted. I would note that the devices mainly being used underage and by children are of the highest permitted nicotine level. They are, advertised with bright colours, cartoon characters in some cases. They're absolutely all over social media, and there's money going into influencing. These are being targeted. We're not talking about medicinal use. We're talking about recreational products which are addictive and health harming, and we have to get on top of this.
In view of the pressure on time, could I ask the 2 other witnesses to, if you agree with what's already been said, say so, and then make any additional points that you need to be made. Obviously, if you don't agree, then that changes the nature of it. Deborah Arnott.
Yes, I agree with the points being made. And on the costs of smoking, the Minister has cited our figures to date, and thank you for that. We've done a lot of work on this. New figures will be published next week, and we will update on those and what the additional costs we think there are, other than the ones that have been taken into account by government so far, which will be available for the committee too.
Would you state the latest research for the record, though, because obviously this committee is here to provide the evidence on the record?
I'd rather not summarise it now, but it will come very quickly, and we can provide it to the committee in advance of publication, so the committee will get the full details. I'd like to go on to talk about Preet's question about the clauses 61 and 62, but also 63, because they are the ones that are absolutely crucial to prevent vapes from appealing to children. I don't know whether I'm allowed to do this, but I will show the committee these. This is a completely reusable vape. This is a completely disposable vape. They look almost identical. They are the same price. So the disposable vapes ban being implemented by DEFRA will get rid of disposable vapes.
Let's interrupt you there. The rules don't allow the use of
I will
props.
share with committee members afterwards. But the point being...
So we'll overlook the fact that you've already used
Sorry, I apologise. But they are just as attractive and just as cheap. And children don't vape because they're disposable. They vape because they're cheap, attractive and available. And that's what we've got to address. Now, when it comes to flavours, which is clause 62, that is quite a difficult clause to implement, which is why in the clause it says that they will have to specify how the flavour of a product is to be determined. This isn't as easy as it sounds. The federal government in Canada, and Canada's probably the best funded enforcement authority with Health Canada, they've got a whole directorate on tobacco and vapes, banned confectionery and dessert flavours in 2018. However, their regulations don't ban the flavours themselves, just the descriptors, because that's the easy bit. They are still working on how to determine vape flavours, and nearly 6 years later, they've still not succeeded. So that's got to be done with care, whereas clauses 61 and 63, which relate to product appearance, packaging and labelling, are much easier to implement and could be done much more quickly. Under these clauses, we could get rid of the bright colouring, cartoon-like imagery and promotional names like, as Caroline has mentioned, unicorn shake, or sweet names like gummy bears or banana milkshake. You know, these are the things that we can get rid of easily, and we need to work very carefully on the regulations to prohibit flavours to make sure that they are effective. But let's get rid of the descriptors now.
Thank you.
Michelle Mitchell. Thank you.
Again,
Chief Executive.
Just additional points that haven't already been made.
Yeah, Michelle Mitchell, Chief Exec, Cancer Research UK. Agree with the points that have been made. I will particularly respond to the question about the age and potentially the postponement above 18. So the first thing I'd say is 2/3 of people die as a result of smoking. We cannot be complacent about smoking rates amongst younger people. Of course, good progress has been made, but we cannot be complacent. We do not want to postpone people starting smoking. We want to prevent them starting smoking. And we have seen how addictive smoking is. We've seen the impact of previous increases in the age of legislation, a 30% reduction in the numbers of people smoking previously between the ages of 16 and 18 when the legislation was introduced. And I think that point stands strongly. I have a prop, which I won't use, given the Chair's views, but it would indicate, if I was allowed, the tar that goes into somebody's lungs just from smoking, put it down again, 10 cigarettes a day for 1 year. And this creates damage for families, affects the productivity of the economy, impacts in a costly way the NHS, and destroys lives. So strong legislation applied with the recommendations around
Thank you.
The legislation is supported.
I'm going to take two questions from members now, one after the other, and then we'll come back to it. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Chair. Public health messaging is most effective in its simplicity. Should the restrictions on vaping being advertised, for instance, on football shirts, be that in line with tobacco, and also should there be similar restrictions around where people can vape as there is with smoking?
Well, in which case, Dr. Caroline Johnson. No?
Thank you, Chair. I want to ask about the passive effect of vaping. We know that if you're a bit proximal to someone vaping, you can smell the blueberry flavour or whatever. And I'm just wondering if you have any evidence on the passive health effects of that vapes.
Could I start with Michelle Mitchell, please?
So, I mean, I think Deborah's going to pick up the vaping, aren't you, Deborah? Yeah. Do you want to do that?
Well, just to say that actually I think that question is best put to Professor Anne McNeill, who you will be seeing this afternoon, because it's actually a really technical question and needs answering by a scientist. But in principle, as Michelle has pointed out, you know, what cigarette smoke has in it, with tar and nicotine and carbon monoxide, is much more harmful than any passive effect from vaping, which may be unpleasant with the flavours, but that's something else.
Is that the settled view of all three?
Yes.
Yes? No?
Well, I just want to add to it, please. Scotland already has legislation on the books from 2016, which was fully debated and passed in the Scottish Parliament. And there are 3 final sets of regulations to be enabled, which would allow closing down displays in shops for vaping products, on billboards and bus shelters, ending sponsorship, which is speaking to the issue of local sports clubs and things, and stopping free samples. So Scotland has the powers in law to introduce those regulations. I would hope that the Scottish Parliament and Government would move ahead with that because it's complementary to the measures being discussed here. In terms of vape aerosol and heated tobacco product aerosol, there is conclusive evidence of aerosol particulate matter, which is similar to that has been extensively researched for air pollution. So we could expect to see similar effects. There is specific research going on, I believe, in Italy on vapour and ultrafine particles, which move differently to larger particles. So we can send you further information and background on that. I would say Anne McNeill, much as I respect her, her background is psychology, and probably you need to be looking at air quality research. And there has been some work done on that, which I'll send you references.
Thank you, Michelle.
We're also very happy to provide literature and evidence review of the leading science in this issue from around the world.
Thank you. I'm going to take 2 more questions. Kirsty Oswald and Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe just to expand on a point made earlier, I wonder what more is necessary in terms of promotion and advertising action. I'm very concerned about football strips with vaping companies and indeed sports stadiums sponsored by vaping companies. I think that the messages that sends to the young people who are taking up vaping in such numbers is hugely problematic. But it strikes me that there are, within your areas of expertise, probably other areas also where we could extend what we're seeking to do here in order that we do the best job possible of trying to close these loopholes down. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Deborah, you've already outlined your support, all 3 witnesses given the support for obviously for the bill. You've already suggested one change that could be made in terms of age verification, similar to Scotland. Are there any other changes that you think should be implemented in the bill that we can make it stronger? Because one of the concerns I think many of us have is we only get a limited number of chances to actually deal with this challenge in primary legislation. So we need to get as much in as we can to make sure we achieve the smoke-free England that we want to see.
We have 5 minutes left, and I don't think there'll be time for any further questions. So if we could respond to those. I should say that I'm not entirely sure, I may have missed it, but anybody responded to Rachel Maskell's points. So if you could, in responding, cover that as well. I don't know who wants to begin.
Just to confirm, Rachel, it was about public health messaging and restrictions and smoke-free laws, yes?
Yeah. Where people can vape.
Yeah. I think to go to that one first, I think it's really important, and the CMO has said this too, to make the distinction between smoking and vaping. And smoke-free laws were implemented after very strong evidence about the secondhand smoke causing lung cancer and heart disease. We don't have that for vaping. I don't think it's important that regulations are in place and that people, and we're seeing that, you can't vape on public transport or in aeroplanes or in most workplaces, and that's fine, but making it legislative implies it's equivalent to smoking. On the point about displays and promotion, what I'd say is that our surveys show that children are most aware of promotion of vapes in store and online, and that's where the priority has to be in strengthening the legislation, and the display ban would be, restrictions on how products are displayed and the packaging and labelling stuff we've already talked about are really important. In terms of additional measures, I think on the vaping side, the one thing I would say is vital is that clause 63, which is about generic, about product requirements. At the moment, you can, it doesn't allow for changing the product requirements which were set out in the tobacco and related product regulations following on from the TPD, the EU Tobacco Products Directive, which were designed in 2013, which is over 10 years ago. We need the government to have powers to change the general product requirements, not just ones relating to branding, and that's the other amendment on vaping I think is really important. There are other things, but I think possibly I've run out of time, so we can share those with the committee separately.
That would be helpful, thank you. Is there anything additional either of the two witnesses want to make very briefly, because we are literally up against the clock? Yes, Sheila.
Thank you for your time. Ash Scotland supports an increasing European movement towards safe spaces, smoke and aerosol-free environments for the sake of health. I would say that the evidence base on tobacco, we have 100 years of scientific evidence, and it took 30 to 60 years to see the heaviest health impacts from tobacco. And we should be more cautious about e-cigarettes as recreational products. The World Health Organization, in its call to action in December last year, suggested that they should be carefully handled as cessation products, not as a whole population approach. So we would support ambient advertising being closed down, sponsorship being closed down. And in terms of what further the UK Parliament could do, use the powers you have to regulate things like social media, be very aware of the massive commercial influences on the thinking, which far outweigh any resource that small third sector advocacy organisations can bring.
Thank you. Very brief final word from
we
Michelle
need to
Mitchell.
keep our eye on the big prize. We've talked about the evidence and statistics in relating to smoking. This would be a world-leading piece of legislation, and we urge you to, in Parliament, pass it in full with the scope that's recommended by the government. And I think future generations would look back and you would be leaving an incredible legacy of health, wealth and a healthy country.
Thank you very much. Could I, and apologies that it was all a bit rushed, but the nature of these things is that we have to use the time as effectively as possible. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank the witnesses for their very helpful evidence and guidance, and we very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
From Dr. Charmaine Griffiths, the Chief Executive of the British Heart Foundation, and Sarah Sleet, the Chief Executive Officer of Asthma and Lung UK. We have until 10:40 for this session. Could I ask the witnesses to introduce themselves and give their title for the record, and then we'll move into the questions.
Good morning, my name is Dr. Charmaine Griffiths and it's my privilege to be Chief Executive of the British Heart Foundation.
Thank you, and my name is Sarah Sleet and I'm the Chief Executive of the Asthma and Lung UK.
Thank you. Right, can we now move on to questions from the committee, and can I begin with a couple of questions for Preet Gill?
Thank you, Chair. You will know that the government obviously has a very clear target to sort of narrow the gap in healthy life expectancy between highest and lowest areas in the next 5 years. Do you think smoking rates are particularly high in certain parts of the country, and therefore are the health benefits following the ban likely to be more prevalent in some places than others? That's my first question. Second question is something I'm very concerned about is the huge rise in youth vaping in recent years. Are you concerned about the increase in vaping even amongst those groups who have not previously smoked cigarettes? Thank you.
I'm going to take the Minister and then we can answer both sets of questions together. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm also very interested in the impact on particularly children's hearts and lungs of both smoking and vaping, and I would very much appreciate both of your professional assessment on the particular vulnerability of children's lungs and hearts over those of adults, please. And I know that the opposition spokesman and I share that really grave concern, as do a number of colleagues. And my second question is, do you expect that the smoke-free generation policy will stop young people from starting smoking? Thank you.
Thanks. I don't know which order you want to take them in.
Happy we can do a double up between us.
Okay.
Thank you for such clear questions. So in terms of inequality, we know the burden of smoking is an uneven burden, that we have a third more smokers in the third most deprived areas. So it is something that affects both the health of people very unequally. And there is no doubt, I mean, smoking is the world's biggest killer. Heart disease is the world's biggest killer. Absolutely no doubt that smoking is one of the major forces driving cardiovascular disease. So from an inequalities point of view, the picture's clear, very well established. In terms of young people, we share your concern at the British Heart Foundation. It scares me to think that today 350 young people will start smoking for the first time, the same tomorrow, the day after, the day after. And we know a huge proportion of those people go on to be long-term smokers, and you know, tragically we see the burden of and cost to life and quality of life that causes, with about 15,000 deaths every year across the UK from heart and circulatory disease associated with tobacco. So we are deeply worried about people starting, and it's not just us as a British Heart Foundation are worried. We know that the majority of smokers wish they'd never started, but nicotine being an incredibly addictive substance, once you have started, being incredibly difficult to stop. So we share your concern. I might just do two things there on the biology, just a little. So the way that smoking is so damaging, of course, to our hearts and circulatory system is manifold. It absolutely damages the lining of our circulatory system, causing our arteries to clog up with fatty deposits, and that puts us at an incredibly high risk of heart attacks and strokes. So we know that the risk of a smoker having a heart attack is double on someone who doesn't, and a stroke 3 times. And if someone smokes 20 cigarettes a day, it's actually 6 times more likely they'll have a stroke. So there's really clear evidence on the biology that smoking is damaging. We're deeply worried about young people starting, and I think that's where the power of this bill comes in. What an opportunity to create for the first time a smoke-free generation, relieving tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from the risk of death and disability from smoking. And we as a BHF would urge the bill be pushed through in full. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything you wish to add to that?
Yes, so asthma and lung very much support this bill because the effect of smoking on lung disease is profound, it's deadly. Lung disease is the third biggest killer in the UK, and of the 100,000 people that die every year, 35% of those, so more than a third, are actually killed effectively by smoking. Smoking is profoundly damaging to people and their children and those who live around them. So it's not just the person who's smoking, it's also the family that live around who are profoundly affected by it. We know that it drives health inequalities and it's also a cause of health inequalities. We know that smoking is responsible for half of the gap between those with the best life expectancy and those with the poorest life expectancy. So if you really wanted to tackle health inequalities, you really need to tackle smoking as your first point of call. It's the biggest single driver of health inequalities. And for people with lung disease, they are most exposed to that health inequality issue. So we really support driving this forward, and we'd like to support everything that British Heart Foundation have said.
Thank you. Could members of the committee who want to ask a question indicate?
Chair, I asked a specific question about children's asthma and children's heart damage. I wonder if I could just urge our witnesses to respond to that question, because it wasn't answered.
Yes,
thank you.
So thank you, and apologies if we didn't cover that as clearly as we could have. Obviously, there is no safe thing as a cigarette. You know, the no safe number of cigarettes, no safe age to start smoking at all. So we would emphasise that concern for children starting, as the damage starts as soon as you start smoking. There is no safe number of cigarettes to have. And combined with that, the fact that nicotine is so addictive that it leads to most people who start becoming smokers, over 2/3 go on to be long-term smokers, worries us enormously. So in terms of both the risk and the damage starting and the number of people doing it, and the fact that those people go on to have a lifelong smoking habit caused by nicotine is of deep concern to us.
And if I may just add, in terms of children as well, I think it's worth thinking about the wider environment. So children who live in households where the adults smoke are 4 times more likely to smoke themselves and find it much harder to give up. So, you know, children are getting into a cycle of deprivation, of damage to their long-term health, you know, right from the very beginning. So for children, stopping smoking availability is going to be profoundly helpful for their future lives, their ability to contribute to the economy, their prospects overall. So I think this bill that sort of tackles the issue from childhood up is really going to be one of the most profoundly important health interventions that you could make.
Rachel Maskell. Briefly.
Literally, I think the Minister was referring to vapes and the evidence base around the impact on lungs, hearts, growing lungs and hearts. Is there anything you'd like to say just briefly before you move on?
Thank you. So, as Deborah from ASH said just previously, obviously vaping is a fairly new product, and research and evidence base, as we have in abundance for tobacco and smoking, is still forming. However, there are early indications, of course, that it's not great for health, and we are cautious and worried about the long-term implications. What we do know is that vaping can be an important cessation tool for those smokers trying to quit, and we know that so many do want to quit. So we would strongly encourage anything that stopped people who were turning to vaping as an alternative for smoking for the first time. It's of deep concern to us that we don't understand the long-term health implications, but the addiction to nicotine deeply concerns us.
Yeah, I think we would very much agree with this. It's a very delicate balancing act between the harms that are caused by smoking and looking to the long term in terms of vaping. But quite clearly, smoking is far more damaging for adults and children, and anything that can steer people away from that will be more healthy in the long run than carrying on smoking. But we do recognise that attention needs to be paid and more research needs to be put into this.
Thank you. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you. Clearly smoking is far more harmful than vaping. However, research by UCL has shown that there's DNA methylation changes linked to carcinogenous and from vaping in the oral cavity, which would also translate quite probably to the lungs as well. Should we be looking at this legislation not with the naivety with perhaps how smoking was looked at in the past, but taking those advanced steps to ensure that we don't see an inducement of lung disease in the future?
I think, as I said earlier, I think it's a delicate balancing act. We need to move people away from smoking, and anything that does that is a good thing. But we need to look at the long-term effects, as I said, of vaping. And the balancing act in the proposals around restricting access to vaping, making sure that nobody under the age of 18 should get access to it, denormalising it by taking it away behind the counter, etc. All of those are good measures to reduce children moving on to vaping. But they need to be enforced. And we need to make sure that we have the right enforcement action in place to make sure that that actually happens.
Perhaps add that you gave a great example of gave a great example of early science that causes us concern, and perhaps won't surprise you to know as a body, a BHF that's based in science and evidence, we take the kind of statistics incredibly seriously, and we are worried. It will go, the body of evidence will grow. We would hugely support and welcome a position where vaping was available to people as a cessation tool, but absolutely was discouraged from anybody else as taking it up as a starting point for nicotine consumption.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this morning. I just wondered if you could just take us through the impact that second-hand smoking has on health.
So it has a huge impact, and thanks to some of the legislation that has walked before the one we're talking about today, we've seen some improvements, of course, that we can measure and track with great certainty from that. Secondhand smoke is undoubtedly a cause of cardiovascular disease, and for those people unfortunate enough to be exposed to it, a serious issue. Just over 15 years ago, there was a study that looked at coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease in men and showed a significant uplift of those exposed to secondhand smoke on a regular basis. That was around the equivalent of smoking 9 cigarettes a day in risk. So there's a very clear basis that secondhand smoke causes heart and circulatory disease.
Yes, and I would add to that in terms of smoking in closed places, of course there was the legislation back in 2015 about children and smoking in cars. That was based on very good evidence and for very good reasons, and I think that proved a popular measure to introduce, and I think second-hand smoking in this context as well, it's an important additional thing to consider in terms of the harms balanced against the need to restrict these particular products.
Trudy Harrison.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you both for joining us this morning. A question for both of you, really. Whilst the harms of vaping are becoming better understood, what do we know about the behaviours around vaping? I ask as an MP that represents a northern constituency of Copeland, where smoking is above the national average, where health inequalities are more prevalent, and where deprivation is also a factor. So are we seeing the same kind of mapping of deprivation in areas where people are starting to vape? Are we aware of that copycat behaviour of children mimicking their parents or other people in the households? And also, are we starting to see some patterns of the age groups starting to vape? That statistic, 350 young people starting to smoke every day, is shocking. What do we know about vaping?
So not as much as we would like is the headline, but I don't think it would surprise any of us to know that people follow cues in their environment. And that's partly what happens around them in their social environment. But I'd like to perhaps to draw attention to what happens in shops, convenience stores where people are buying vapes. It doesn't take, I was looking at my local one in thinking about today as I went around my local convenience store that's not far from a school. It doesn't take a lot to look at what's happening behind the counter to see the packaging, the marketing, the highly brightly coloured products that are clearly labelled, named, flavoured in a way to be attractive to children with, whether it be cherry cola vapes or candy cotton vapes, things that are very deliberately sweet, targeted at children, I would say. So it causes us great concern that that's going to be such a huge influence on so many children. We see that playing out in prevalence. I don't know, Sarah, if there's anything you'd add.
I think you're right that there's no real evidence base around this, and it's something that actually should be done. And something that we would very much like to look at. I think when you look at where smoking is very prevalent, as you say, in more deprived areas, people are taking the cues from people around them in terms of their behaviour, and I've no doubt in terms of vaping, people will be looking to similar cues. Are people around them smoking? Is it easy to get hold of? Is it completely normalised? And I think we'll find a very similar pattern, but we do need to get that evidence.
Thank you. Mary Kelly-Floyd.
I know we've heard, obviously this bill is covering tobacco and vaping, and we've talked quite a bit there about the advertising of and the packaging of vapes. Do you think we could go further with the actually tackling tobacco control, which is the biggest killer, around the advertising, the packaging of tobacco and the flavoured tobaccos?
I think we'd welcome anything that stops people smoking or beginning vaping as a start point of their addiction to nicotine, given the scale of devastation it has on people personally, as well as on, of course, our NHS in terms of cost and burden, and as well as all the other impacts that it has. So we fully support all of the bill going through in full as it is now, and if there are opportunities and support for strengthening it, I'm sure we would welcome those too. I think it is what a moment we have where the majority of people across the UK support the bill and would love to see a smoke-free generation. And the fact you have 51% of retailers also supporting it, I think, speaks to how powerful a moment it is, and anything we can do to strengthen the bill and absolutely protect it from being diluted. We know that the tobacco industry, of course, would be campaigning in the opposite direction and to limit any restrictions, of course, that would impact its success. And so we're really mindful of that and would urge the committee and everyone who can to protect the bill from diluting the impact it has to save and improve lives. It is going to be potentially a transformative piece of legislation.
And I'd just like to add, in terms of the support, we asked our supporters who was in favour of this bill. Now, bear in mind that many of our supporters will possibly still be smoking or will be ex-smokers. 84% supported this bill and really want to see it come through. We hear day to day on our helplines people saying, I wish I had never taken up smoking, who are completely addicted, find it almost impossible to get out of smoking, and whose health is slowly being degraded over time and having to come out of the workforce, having to retire early, and of course potentially facing death as well.
Thank you.
Now we have time for another round of questions if members want to. Kirsty Oswald.
Kirsten Oswald, Chair.
Sorry?
I thought you called me Kirsty Oswald. There. That's not my name.
Kirsten.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kirsten, yes.
Thank you, Chair.
I do apologise.
That's okay. I'm grateful to you both for the comments that you've made so far. And I wonder if you might want to talk to us a little bit further about your thoughts on groups of people, particularly young people. I think that this is a theme that you'll hear around the table. Groups of people who are taking up vaping but who have not previously smoked, and whether the measures in this bill go as far as you would want in trying to prevent that from being the direction of travel.
So if the committee is minded to strengthen anything that would, of course, prohibit people starting vaping in the first instance, where they're not doing so as a cessation tool. I hope it's really clear that we believe that as a cessation tool, this is a product that has its place. It would help thousands of smokers give up and ideally prevent them from, loss of quality of life or tragically life. I hope that's explicitly clear. If the committee was minded to strengthen the approach to vaping, I think that could have incredible impact. What we are worried about is people using vaping as a start and entry point to nicotine. Nicotine's so highly addictive. You can see that in the number of smokers who desperately want to give up. We've both spoken to those in abundance. So anything that helps us get to that point, I think, would be welcome.
Yeah, nicotine we know is as addictive as heroin and cocaine. It is a terrible, terrible addiction. However, I think in terms of vaping, it's really, it's going to be quite tricky to get that balancing act right. So going back to that again, we really need to have vaping as a cessation tool. We know it's more effective than just about anything else you can have in terms of cessation. So if you, for example, when it comes to flavouring, if you make that too much of too difficult, too problematic for people to switch, then there is a chance that we may have a real problem in terms of stopping smoking. But on the other hand, we really, really do not want people to be attracted into vaping who have never smoked. So as I understand it, though that bit of the legislation is in secondary legislation and can be adapted over time, and I think that's something that a lot of attention is going to need to be given to how people have actually responded and how they're behaving, and then adjust over time.
If the Nikki, no, sorry, yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Chair. You've been quite clear, even though we don't have the evidence to understand the impacts of vaping yet, that it's a very important cessation tool. Do you see a world in which it could be prescribed as a cessation tool as opposed to being available as a retail product?
So that is, I believe that's a system in Australia where it's prescribed. And I think that is a possibility. It needs to be well researched in terms of would it still encourage people who need to stop smoking to actually use that as a tool, or would it put a barrier up for them in using the tool? So I think before we move to that, we would need some really good behavioural evidence that it's not going to be a further barrier for people to move to it. If it isn't, then that could be a really good option.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to take the Minister at this point and then pre-Cargill.
Thank you. Some people say that the smoking generation doesn't need to go a year higher every single year. Can you say, for the record, what your view is of that? Does it need to keep lifting each year?
We support it as it's written with that the bill exactly as it is at the moment. I mean, it's really important to recognise, as it's proposed, it doesn't inhibit anybody who's currently a smoker from purchasing tobacco, but does take us on a really clear and, I believe, transformative path to a smoke-free generation.
I understand that, but
yep.
Why?
Because it's, on for record, a really clear path to make sure that we move to a situation where we've got, of course, a generation that is prohibited from buying cigarettes and disincentivised to do so.
I think we've heard today the evidence about just how harmful and destructive smoking is, particularly for people who are in more deprived areas. And if we really want to tackle that, we need to remove smoking as a normalised, available, legal option going forward. And this seems to me a very measured and thoughtful way of actually introducing a smoking ban, which will take hold and is very important for our children going forward.
Cargill.
I just wanted to ask something around the information that gets given to parents, especially if their children have never spoken but they've taken up vapes. And we know that there's a generation of children being addicted to nicotine because what's been classified as 0% nicotine actually does contain nicotine. One of the parents that I spoke to raised an issue about, well, how many puffs are there in one vape? Because, you know, if my child has 2 or 3 of those in a day, what does that actually mean? And I think it's that sort of information, it's that sort of risk and how we share that information with parents that are trying to address this issue with their children. Is there anything you want to say about that, and is there any research being done to look at that?
I would observe that there is so much variation between products and how people are consuming them. It's I think, quite difficult to give advice in a standard way, and that's part of it being an emergent product and market, I think, as well. But there is no doubt that, as we've discussed, nicotine being so deeply addictive, it's an incredible worry that a child has a single puff on a vape. Given the potency of nicotine and where we know that leads people to, and have seen over generations that lead to with smoking. I think it is, I perhaps take the moment to emphasise, we really also support the investment, the £70 million being allocated to public health campaigning and cessation services, as well as enforcement, because I think you're right that we need to be really clear on messaging around the bill to encourage support from parents and others around children in particular. So we would really applaud the decision to put resourcing behind this as well. We know that's effective. Public campaigning can be an incredibly powerful tool. We were really proud to run the Give Up Before You Clog Up fatty cigarette campaign way back 20 years ago, and we know that led to 14,000 smokers, even in that campaign, seeking to quit. So it's we know public campaigning works, and I would suggest that it's a really great thought to have allocated that resource to that as part of this work. It's going to be needed.
And I think the variation in nicotine levels and the method of delivery which affects the uptake of the nicotine is very concerning in vapes, undoubtedly. And I'm a mother. I've got 3 sort of adult children, but who all vape, and I am very, very concerned about how often they're doing that and what impact that's having. But we must also remember that from what we know at the moment, it would appear that smoking is by far and away the most damaging activity compared to vaping. And there is a little bit of concern that we overemphasise the harms of vaping to the extent that people say, well, I might as well smoke then. So, I'll do that instead. So we do need to be very careful about how we have this conversation.
Lisa Cameron.
Thank you so much, Chair. I just wanted to follow up on something that you alluded to earlier in both of your evidence given. Is there any research beginning to form that suggests that whilst vaping can be helpful for cessation, that it might also be a gateway to smoking itself for young people who are starting?
An interesting question, and I can see the clear linkage you've described. I'm today not able to provide any evidence, but very happy to go back and provide as follow-up. Thank you.
I'm not aware of any evidence around this either.
That's a great question.
Are there any further questions? Dr. Dr. Caroline Johnson. This will be the final question.
Health Select Committee, of which I'm a member, we heard evidence that some school children with lung diseases like asthma were not able to visit the school toilets during the school day because of the overwhelming smell and of people vaping in there was triggering their asthma. Sarah, have you heard anything about that? Do you have any evidence about asthma in children or adults being triggered by the vaping?
So we have heard anecdotally that people have had issues around being around vaping. but there isn't any robust evidence as to whether it genuinely triggers asthma for some of those people. I think it is an area that we want to look into a bit further, but what I would say is that here's a clear case of where children, the law is children should not be vaping, so we really do need to make sure that enforcement is in place as far as possible to prevent that from happening.
If I may clarify, is that an absence of evidence or evidence that exists but is inconclusive?
I'm not aware of any serious evidence that has been gathered around this at this stage, and I think it probably needs to be looked at.
Thank you.
Well, in which case, can I thank the two witnesses for being both concise, which enabled us to get through all of the questions, but also informative, and I'm sure we've benefited from the evidence you've given. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
If we can now move on to the third panel, which will consist of Michael Shanks, the chair of the Matthew Shanks, chair of the secondary head teacher reference group, and Patrick Roach, the general secretary of NASUWT. We have for this session until 11:10. Thank you. Could I ask the two witnesses to state their name and their titles for the benefit of the record, please?
Okay, Matthew Shanks. I'm the chair of the Secondary Head Teachers Reference Group and CEO of MAT in Deborah, South West.
And good morning. I'm Patrick Roach. I'm General Secretary of NASUWT, the Teachers Union.
Thank you. I'm going to move straight into the questions, and I'm going to take Preet Gill to ask the first question, and then I'll move over to the Minister for her first question.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for giving evidence today. Would you say that it's underage smoking or vaping which is the bigger issue in schools today, and what is the impact that you are seeing on, education, but of course in behaviour of children? And my second question is, will the measures in the bill to restrict sales of vaping products to children under 18 work, in your opinion?
Okay. Let me take those questions first, and I'll come to the Minister.
Okay, so it's a very interesting question in terms of whether vaping or smoking is more popular amongst children in schools. All I can say is that it has increased in the last 3 or 4 years. We see evidence of vaping. It's more difficult to catch children vaping because of the size of the vapes, and also the fact that the smell is slightly different, doesn't set off smoke alarms in the same way, etc. I think it is fair to say that smoking and vaping are still as popular as they were amongst younger children in certain areas, and vaping has been seen to be a safe alternative. I think the marketing of vapes in different flavours and colours makes it akin to a progression from chewing gum for some families in terms of bubblegum flavours, etc. There's also anecdotal evidence of parents talking about if it's grapefruit, then it must be safe. So there's that evidence around it as well out there, because there's in the way in which they're marketed. If you see them in shops, they seem safe, they seem okay. The size of them makes it very difficult in terms of behaviour to actually admonish children for it, because they can hide them very easily. They also look like mini hard drive sticks. I think there's a deliberate targeting of that around the way that they're marketed in terms of the cleverness of it. But certainly in terms of behaviour, it is something else that you're dealing with when you're saying to a child, a teenager, you've been vaping, no you haven't, and there's nowhere for you then to go. It immediately sets up an issue. Question about the toilets earlier was interesting, because children tend to vape in toilets. It's easier for them to vape in toilets than it was for them to smoke in toilets. And very quickly, I mean, you just need to see people on public transport vaping. It's quite easy for it to dissipate very quickly and disappear. So I would say, yes, I think vaping is a real issue in schools for children.
Yeah, and I support fully what Matthew's just said. I mean, the reality is that I don't think it's either or. I think the reality is that smoking is a threat to children and young people in terms of their health, their well-being, but also their ability to participate and to progress educationally. But so too are vapes and vaping. The NSWT, at the start of this academic year, published our own research into vaping in schools from the perspective of teachers and school leaders. And, very much reinforces what Matthew has just said there, that vaping is pretty much predominant in terms of an activity taking place amongst secondary aged pupils. But we are seeing teachers reporting pupils vaping from as early as 10 years of age, so primary phase is also impacted. Teachers are reporting, 3/4 of teachers reporting a significant increase in the participation in vaping by pupils in their schools. So the reality is that we're seeing an upward curve in respect of vaping activity within schools. All the issues that have just been mentioned there about the difficulty that schools have to detect and to control this kind of behaviour, the way in which vape products are available to pupils, whether masquerading as hard drives or masquerading as highlighter sticks or masquerading as something else, that it would be legitimate for a pupil to be bringing into schools. This is not a situation in which you catch a pupil with a packet of cigarettes, you confiscate. Firstly, you've got to identify what on earth is that this pupil has. And, at the end of the day, good order in schools is dependent upon, there being trust and respectful relationships between teachers and students. You can't go around every moment of every day asking, pupils to turn out their pockets and inspecting what they have in there. The reality is that we're seeing, though, the impact not just of vaping on pupils' health, because we are seeing pupils who are presenting as ill as a result of the overuse, in fact all of it is overuse, but the use of vaping products, and are therefore becoming ill in schools. But we're also seeing the impact on educational participation, progression and achievement. When pupils are, diving off into the toilets in order to vape, that interrupts teaching and learning. When pupils are late arriving at school, perhaps because they've been vaping en route, that is impacting on pupils' learning. We're seeing bullying behaviours within schools, because quite often vaping products are being informally circulated or exchanged or acquired. So it becomes another source of behaviour, a behavioural challenge for teachers and for head teachers. So from a teacher's perspective, vaping is a serious issue within schools, and one that we're pleased that this bill is seeking to address.
Thank you both so much for being here, and also particularly for the work that the NASUWT has done in terms of the impact on schools. Could you expand on that a bit further in terms of, I've done a couple of visits ahead of this bill to meet with enforcement officers, for example, who've given me anecdotal evidence that teachers say that pupils will return to the classroom with their eyes spinning and unable to concentrate because of the heady nature of whatever it is they've just been vaping or smoking. So that was one thing. And another anecdote about a school where children decided to drink the vape fluid, and actually the school had an emergency sort of evacuation as a result of that. And I just wonder, in terms of the specific health impacts and the ability of children at the one end to concentrate on the class when you're kind of spaced out on vapes, and at the other end, the very real risk to children of doing something stupid with a vape, which was entirely unintended with disastrous consequences. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, and very much appreciate your remarks about the research that the NSWT has undertaken. And we come at the problem of vaping from the point of view of our members in classrooms, in schools, the length and breadth of the country, and what do teachers need in order to be able to teach effectively, what do they believe that pupils need in order to be able to learn effectively. They need good order in the classroom. And so, my perspective is not one of a medical practitioner or somebody that's wanting to assume that I have the knowledge on, the impacts of vaping on a child's physical development. What we're concerned about is the impact on a child's educational development, participation and achievement. And the reality is that everything that you've mentioned there is absolutely right. Whether it's about the way in which vaping products might be unintentionally used by pupils, whether it's about how they seek to confiscate them about their person, or indeed the drinking of vaping fluids, as if somehow that would be get the high without necessarily being detected, or whether it's about the use of vaping products as a stimulant, which impacts not only on concentration but on behaviour and indeed on a child's well-being in the classroom. The use of vaping in a school, Matthew's already referenced, the difficulty of detecting the vapes sometimes because they can dissipate very quickly. But they can also trigger fire alarms within schools. And we've had plenty of examples of teachers and head teachers reporting that their school has had to evacuate the building on not just one occasion in a day, not just two, but multiple times, 5, 6 occasions during the course of the day. That's the loss of learning, not just for that one pupil or that class of pupils, but for the entirety of the school. So we're really concerned about the impact of all of that. But of course, teachers are concerned not just about a child's educational development, they're also concerned about, in the round, about a child's well-being. And teachers are reporting the very damaging impact that vaping can have, just as smoking can have, on a child's mental and physical development. And that's one of the reasons why we've called, and we're pleased that the government has responded to say that actually we need to be doing more to strengthen the enforcement of the rules around vaping and their access and availability for school-age pupils. But we need to do as much as we possibly can to prevent any school-age pupil getting access to vaping products, whether in school or outside of school, and we're pleased that the bill seeks to do just that.
Mr. Shanks, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just to absolutely echo and reinforce what Patrick has said, but also to say, as school leaders, we're looking after teachers, but we also are caring for families as well. And I think this will help families to understand that actually it's not okay for their children to vape. Anecdotally, we have parents say to us, well, they let them vape at home, but it's better than them smoking or being out on the streets because they don't see the harm in it. So it's really important that is recognised as well. And the banning of tobacco sale is really interesting in terms of the prescription of it. But at the moment out there, vaping is seen as safe by the general public, I would posit.
I wonder if you can develop on some of the points that you've made, which I think have been very useful. I'm hearing anecdotally about issues in schools where the addiction of children to these vapes is itself causing a problem because the children are unable to sit in the classroom and are actually having to go out with whatever excuse being made to go and vape so that they feel able to then come back to the classroom, such as the level of their addiction to these products. And I wonder, sort of slightly going beyond that, what your views on the way that these things are promoted are. I've got a particular concern about vape companies advertising on sports strips and sports stadiums, for instance, and that impact upon these same young people who are so addicted.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely completely agree with you. The way in which vapes are marketed, as I said before, the colours, the flavours, etc., the places that they're marketed suggest to people that they are safe. Yeah. The fact that they are put forward as a safe, in inverted commas, alternative to cigarettes. The fact that parents use them, the fact that there are lots of vape shops opened in high streets with colourful, etc. All of those aspects put forward the idea that vaping is a thing that is okay to do. But at the same time, getting into a child's mindset, because we've all been there, we like to break the rules as children. We like to feel like we're pushing at boundaries. We know that it's not okay, but actually it's made okay. So therefore, more children engage in it, I would suggest, than cigarette smoking, because they're not sure what the harmful effects are, etc. And I think that is the danger in it. And I do think it leads on, because the younger children vape. By the time you're 16, 17, maybe it's not cool to vape anymore, so therefore you go onto cigarettes or you go onto other things. Also, anecdotally, we've heard of schools down in the southwest where people are putting cannabis into the vapes as well, so the addiction grows from that point of view as well. People coming out of lessons, the agitation, maybe, well, my agitation if I didn't have 3 coffees in the morning would be quite high. I think children not getting nicotine, going through all the other things that they're going through, they really do present as confrontational then to staff, which makes it difficult to deal with them in classrooms, to also engage them in their learning. Whilst at the same time you have parents at home, to repeat the point I made earlier, who are saying, well, it's okay to do. So there is, I would absolutely concur with the idea of the way it is marketed, etc.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because those are important points, the advertising of these, as you say, if vaping producers, manufacturers, or indeed those who are supplying vapes are advertising freely in ways which could be appealing to children and young people, that makes their products increasingly attractive to children and young people. The way in which vapes are also advertised, the way in which the marketing descriptors are used for those products, all the evidence that we have, and certainly that our members tell us, and our survey was of 4,000 teachers. This is not anecdote. This is something which is impacting right across the system. Tells us that the way in which those products are marketed, the way in which they are described, is deliberately seeking to entice young people to make use of those products. And I think that if there's areas that can be looked at in the context of the bill itself, where if there's any potential for further strengthening of the bill, and we believe it is a strong bill, by the way, it sets out very clearly what the societal expectation is in this particular space. But there are always, with any legislation, there's always scope for loopholes, describing a product in a way that makes it enticing before an individual understands what they're getting themselves into is something that I think it would need to be considered and addressed. So from our point of view, it is about advertising. It's also, though, about access to these products. Because the best will in the world, no matter how they're advertised, if they're easily available at the point of sale, that makes things incredibly difficult. I remember bringing up my own children and worrying about going to the supermarket with them because they were surrounded by candy, by sweet products at the checkouts, and you could not navigate your way through the checkouts. Thankfully, things have moved on, and I think that has changed, and many parents, I think, are benefiting from those changes. Well, at the point of sale for so many of these products is very much at the point at which young people are interacting. They're in the shops that are in the vicinity on the route to and from school. They're being marketed in places that young people will frequent, whether that be the kind of local cafe, whether that be going to the hairdressers or the barbers. That they are in places that young people will be, and they're immediately available. So the more that we can do to stop that immediacy of marketing of these products, no matter how they're described, that easy availability to these products, the better.
Dr. Lisa
Chair. I've been hearing from local parents and schools in my constituency that they're very concerned that children are going out at lunch times and spending their money for lunch on vapes, and that they're therefore not having anything nutritious during the day either. Is there any evidence that you feel that might be a pattern that's developing and impacting children's physical health and well-being in that respect as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think children will find any which way they can to do something that they want to do, and I think at the moment, whilst this is not illegal, then they will gather more people to follow the crowd and go out. In my experience, the majority of children wants to do as they are instructed to do, probably about 85% anecdotally over the years, but they will follow the herd. And at the moment, there's a greater herd growing because of all the things we've talked about marketing, colour, etc. with regard to vape. So going out at lunchtime, spending their money on that instead of food, absolutely I would see, because there's a peer pressure to do that as well. So it's taking more people with them. Because, as Patrick said, you can see it in the barbers, you can see it in the shops, etc. So.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, there's also the bullying behaviours as well, which manifest themselves, and whether it's a pupil is making the choice to go out at lunchtime in order to acquire vapes, or they are feeling coerced to do so. Either way, there is an issue, and so the availability of those products in the proximity of schools, I think, is something that needs to be considered. So that would be a point that we would make. I think that schools increasingly have introduced systems to seek to ensure that, for example, that children are being fed at lunchtimes, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. But again, the issue is not so much that. These products are as cheap as chips in some instances, particularly when we're talking about disposable vapes. And I know that's an issue that is of concern to the government, and it's of concern to us and to our members, that it's really important that we look at how we can ban the sale entirely of these disposable vapes, because these products, frankly, no one knows what's in them, and they're incredibly cheap to acquire. So even if you're getting your lunch and your parent can see what you had on Tuesday lunchtime, because it comes up on their phone and they can see it. Nevertheless, if you've spent 10 minutes popping out to the local shop to acquire some vapes, how will parents know about that, particularly if they are of the disposable variety? So, more that can be done to not only limit appeal, but reduce availability of those products, accessibility of those products to young people. The more that can be done on that, the better.
I've got 4 more people who want to, actually it's just gone up to 5, who want to get in, and we've got about 12 or 13 minutes left. So it's unlikely that I'll be able to get everybody in. But if members who put a question do so as briefly as they possibly can, and the witnesses respond as concisely as possible, I'll try to get everybody in. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Chair. There was nothing magical about your 18th birthday, and the legislation clearly talks about the 18 being a cut-off age. Would it assist if that age was to be heightened, for instance, 20 in Japan, 21 in California? Not least, as has already been mentioned, the impact of nicotine, cannabis, and I'm also hearing synthetic drugs as well.
I would absolutely agree.
Well, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Nothing right.
I'm not going to add to that. I mean, partly because I'm here to represent. I'm here representing the interests of our members. I mean, and the issue is one about how we can control access to products, particularly illegal products, in and around school-aged pupils. And therefore, we think it's absolutely right that the bill has identified the need to secure robust measures to protect the health and well-being of children and young people.
Thanks. Bob Blackman.
Thanks, Chairman. Matthew, you talked about the escalation from people, young people, possibly as young as 10, starting to vape and then going on to other tobacco substances. What further measures would be required, in your view, and what further support would teachers need to explain the harm that young people are doing to themselves as a result of vaping and smoking?
Okay, so there's lots of campaigns that explain the harms of vaping and smoking. Sometimes people don't listen and don't engage with it. The only thing that I would say is more people vape and smoke than take drugs which are illegal, because they're illegal. So therefore, if we are saying that tobacco is dangerous and harmful to our people in our society, and our role is to try and protect them and educate them to see what is better, then why is tobacco not illegal as well? If we're not sure where vaping is, and vaping is was started as an alternative to tobacco, which is now jumping on in young people, then is there a similar thing to do with vapes? That is just the view within schools in terms of how we can help children to engage in what they should be doing in schools, which is working at education. There will be other things that have come along, but 15 years ago it was chewing gum everywhere, etc. So it's that, nicotine chewing gum was a big thing. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and the reality is that schools are doing an awful lot to inform, to educate, and indeed to regulate the conduct of children and young people, and to engage with parents and carers as well. But schools can't by themselves change society. They have a tremendous influence over wider society, but by themselves they can't change society. I think anything that we can continue to do to educate young people into the harms, the dangers of smoking and vaping, we should continue to do. Notwithstanding this legislation, that is essential because no legislation is going to eliminate illegality. What we've got to continue to do is to strive to eradicate those behaviours wherever they manifest themselves. But I think the issue that we would say is what other practical measures could that bill include? And I've mentioned the way in which vape products are described. Yeah, we think that there's something that could be done there. The availability, I mean, this is potentially out with the scope of this bill, but certainly in terms of other areas of legislation and regulation, the prohibition on disposable vapes, we think, is an issue that needs to be addressed. The issue of enforcement measures. No point passing legislation if it's not enforced in practice. So ensuring that those enforcement measures are absolutely robust. And also the proximity to schools of any retailer selling vaping products. We think is something that needs to be looked at.
Thank you. Mary Kelly Foy.
Following on from that question, actually, from Bob's, we talk about you're in the position to educate young people about the harms of tobacco. Is there something there as well about educating young people about the harms and the unscrupulous measures that the tobacco industry take and the horrific profits that they're making? And often young people are interested in climate change and other wider issues, and these industries, these organisations are having an impact across the whole world. It could be something that young people are interested in about not just their health, but the wider impact on their local communities and indeed people across the world. Obviously, if we had more funding for education with maybe the polluter pay levy, then those type of measures could be looked at. But is there any opportunity for that type of education in schools?
I mean, that is happening at the moment within education, within educational curriculums, etc. But with regards to this, it's the lack of messaging around vaping and the harmful effects and the cheapness of it, etc., compared to tobacco. But even with the harmful effects and the messaging compared to tobacco, teaching that, there are still some families who smoke. There are still people you see, celebrities, etc., smoking. So you're fighting against that all of the time. Would that giving education to children about the harmful effects of things change? We will continue to do that, and we do within the curriculum. We talk about big tobacco companies, as we talk about big pharma, global environment, etc., all within the curriculum. So,
yeah, I mean, the reality is we need more space in the curriculum to do all of that. Absolutely right, and making those connections between, vaping, the impact on a child's health, but also vaping, how these companies are profiteering, often from the most vulnerable, the producers of vaping products and the degradation to the environment, both of those products, but also in terms of how those products are manufactured. All of this is very rich territory. I'd like to see more by way of permission to teachers and school leaders to engage with their pupils about the real everyday concerns that young people have. There should be more scope and space in the curriculum to do that. That's not arguing against teaching of maths, science and languages, but it is about saying that we want to, if you will, produce well-rounded individuals. That for us is the purpose of education, and this is an area area that I think educators have got an important role to play.
I think I would just add to that, go and visit your local schools and see what they're doing around it as well.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. This morning, in previous evidence that we've had from witnesses, we've talked a lot about how vaping is a great smoking cessation tool, but that there is also not enough evidence around the harms of vaping. You've described social harms this morning. You probably see health harms as well. You've surveyed people. You've come and you've given evidence this morning. Have you been asked outside of this for evidence of harms of vaping on the young people that you are looking after? And do you believe that that evidence gathering on whether vaping is harmful is going at a fast enough pace?
So no, prior to now, okay? This is very welcome, which is why I think we've both given the time, because this is important. I think that there's something in the papers this morning about evidence of harm to vaping for children, but it's not headline, it's 7 or 8 people, so people won't read it. I absolutely think there should be more about the harm of vaping, or just the unknown. You don't know what the dangers are necessarily, so therefore why would you engage in it? And we talk a lot when we're doing drug prevention with children about where, apologies if this offends, but where the drugs come from. Do you know where the base of them is? Because what do they contain? In the same way you don't know what is in a disposable vape or another vape, why would you put that into your body? So those are the lessons that we are talking around. So we would certainly welcome more evidence to support that.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that, we know from the feedback we've had from teachers as part of the research that we've done, which has included both quantitative as well as qualitative feedback, the children are getting ill as a result of using vaping products. That's the daily reality that school leaders, that teachers are having to deal with. And the more that we can systematically collect that kind of evidence, whether that is about, a child that ended up being, rushed into hospital because they've been made very ill on the school premises, or indeed there's a near miss within the school. So it's actually data which is collected and collated. I think the better we will be. But the reality is that on an everyday basis, teachers are experiencing this. They're having to deal with these issues, and they're having to intervene and support pupils who are impacted physiologically by the harms of vaping products.
Thank you. A very, very brief final question from Dr. Caroline Johnson, and we do have to finish at 10 past, so I'd ask the witnesses to bear that in mind.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to ask about flavourings, because we've heard that flavourings may encourage some adults to switch. We know that where adults stop smoking using a vape, flavourings may also prolong their addiction to the vapes. And we know that they entice children to vape. So some people are saying we need to keep the flavours for the adults, some people are saying no flavours because it entices children. To govern is to choose. Which do you think is the most important, protecting adults to help them stop smoking, or protecting children from starting vaping?
It's a simple question to finish with, thank you.
Govern is to choose.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I think you can have both, because I would, okay. I think if you look at the way cigarettes are marketed behind a shelf with pictures of the damage that they cause, that's different to the way vapes are marketed with their colourful packaging and excellent flavours, which appeals to children. So if you change the way they were marketed, you could have both, because you could still help adults with the flavourings, but not make them appealing to children.
Simple answer, protect children from harm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Could I thank the witnesses for giving us a very particular perspective that we hadn't previously heard about how all this impacts on teaching and the education sector in general. We're very grateful for that, and I'm sure all the committee found it really helpful. So thank you very much. And we bring on the next witnesses, please. You, can I, first of all, we now hear evidence from Paul Farmer, who's the Chief Executive of Age UK. This is a very brief session, lasted only till 11:25, so it's going to have to be a really snappy time, snappily used time. Mr. Farmer, it seems unnecessary, but for the record, can you simply state your name and title?
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Farmer. I'm Chief Executive of Age UK, the charity supporting older people.
Thank you. Freed Cargill.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Paul. It's good to have you here. And a simple, straightforward question for me. What is Age UK's view on the bill? My first question. My second question is, I know that over 65s are much less likely to smoke. I have a constituent, Eric, who unfortunately has suffered from a stroke, struggled with COPD. Now he's a tobacco campaigner in his 80s. Why is this important? Why is this bill important to the people that Age UK works with?
Thanks very much. Well, Age UK is fully in support of the proposed legislation, and we've been working alongside the Richmond group of health charities to highlight the significant health benefits of phasing out smoking, both for individuals but also the wider impact on society, and particularly the benefits to the NHS, which, as we know, faces significant challenges at the moment. And I think our kind of key focus around this is very much around ensuring that we're thinking, so our job at Age UK is not just to think about the health and well-being of older people as they are now, and I'll come to your second question in a moment, but also to think about the issues of future generations. And this is, I have to say, quite a rare opportunity for us to make a significant impact on future generations of older people for reasons we will look at later. It's also worth noting, however, that this bill is also heavily supported by older people. So 69% of over 65s from polling support this legislation. And why is that? Well, that comes to your second question. Well, first of all, we know from older people, currently all the work we're currently doing, that health and well-being in later life is pretty much the top priority for older people. Age UK has recently published our blueprint for older people for the next few years as we enter an election year. And it's very clear from the work we've done with older people that health and well-being is right at the heart of what's most important for people. And of course, it's logical, isn't it? That ability to feel well, remain active, and maintain our independence is such a major determinant of the quality of life that we aspire to in our later life. But we also know that there is a huge gulf in both life expectancy and life experiences between those who have the opportunity to age well and those who do not. I have heard from your earlier witnesses, so I won't go into detail, points that others have made about the importance of healthy life expectancy. But healthy life expectancy is right at the heart, of course, of older people's considerations. And when healthy life expectancy for those who are most disadvantaged is quite so stark, it's really important for us to do something about that. How does that affect the issue of smoking? Well, smoking, as you know, is a leading cause of death and disability, responsible for half the difference in healthy life expectancy between the most and the least affluent communities. And so people living in the lowest areas are with the lowest healthy life expectancy are 1.7 times more likely to smoke than those living in the highest healthy life expectancy areas. So, I mean, these are fundamental reasons why the intervention of this legislation will make a difference.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you. I'd really like to tackle the fact that young people tend to not consider either their own mortality or their own health and well-being. The majority of young people tend to take that for granted. And yet is also a complete correlation with the age at which you take up smoking or indeed vaping, is when you're young and you feel pretty immortal, or at least you're not concerned about later life. So could you give us a view as an Age UK representative, the sorts of advice that older people who've smoked all their lives and are now bearing the brunt of those decisions they took, on what they would say to those who argue, oh, it's a matter of personal choice, everyone should be free to smoke if they want to smoke. What would an older person say to that young person?
Well, I think a lot of people would say they wish they never started, to be honest. And that's certainly the kinds of conversations we've been having with older people in preparation for this session. And the reason for that is because as you enter into your later life, you start to understand the consequences of smoking through your own personal experience, and the list is frightening. And
for the record, can you outline some of those experiences? Because obviously this is a public evidence session, and we're looking to make the strong case for this bill.
So very clearly, the relationship between smoking and multiple forms of cancer, COPD, pneumonia, heart disease, aortic aneurysm and stroke, vascular diseases, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, hip fracture, cataract and macular degeneration, and dementia. And I think it's a really important context in a society where we are increasingly debating the impact of dementia on our society, the relationship between smoking and dementia as well. So these are in and of themselves very challenging physical health conditions, but we also can see the correlation to people who experience multiple long-term conditions, and I think many older people who experience those multiple long-term conditions, who have to live with the impact of that, often because they smoked in their early life, would say that impact that has on that individual to be able to do the things that they want to do in their later life, pursue their ambitions of later life, are severely detrimented as a result of having smoked in earlier years.
So could I, my just last point, may I just pursue that? Thank you. Would that older person suffering those consequences say, yes, it was all a matter of free choice?
I mean, I think different people will have different opinions about choice and whether it was as a result of choice. I think what many older people have been telling us is that if they had known about the damaging consequences of smoking, they wouldn't have started in the first place, and they would certainly have considered it in a greater way. And I mean, I just want to pay huge tribute to colleagues at British Heart Foundation, who I know you've just heard from, who I think have taken the best way of trying to campaign over a long term on this issue. And this is a long term issue, but sadly today's generation of older people are seeing the consequences of what hasn't happened.
Thank you.
Are there any members of the committee who wish to? Mary Glindon? No? Sorry, Kirsten Oswald?
Thank you very much, Chair. I wonder if you're able to just explain for all of our benefit who are older people, because sadly I recently recognised that this might include more of us than we might like to believe, but you know, we need to take that on board. And what I'm really interested in is the different demographic groups and where you think there might be disproportionate levels of harm within the groups of older people that you support in terms of tobacco and vaping.
Well, we work with people over the age of 50, which may be news to some of you here. But one of the reasons why we've very recently chosen to, if you like, drop the age group that we increasingly work with is precisely for the reasons around prevention and early intervention, if you like. This is not the earliest intervention. You can, of course, argue that many health interventions need to take place amongst children and younger people. But from an Age UK point of view, we know that there is the potential to intervene in people's lives and support people to live healthier lives, and it's not just about health, but in the context of this, it's mainly about health, to be able to lead healthier lives, which means that your healthy life expectancy can improve, and as I mentioned earlier, you can fulfil some of the ambitions of your later life. And of course, the burden of on the NHS of unhealthy life expectancy is a big issue. The bulk of our direct work, of course, is with people over the age of over pensionable age, if you like, and of course, in each of those generations, you see the differences. You see the experiences of each of those generations' experiences of smoking. Somebody who is now in their 80s or 90s will have almost certainly won't be alive if they are a heavier smoker, because they probably won't have benefited from any of the public health information that has taken place in under previous governments. So that's obviously the major difference. I think in terms of the different health conditions, what we know is that certain health conditions will, of course, increase with age. So dementia, of course, is the greatest example of this, where, of course, we know that the older you are, the more likely you are to develop dementia. So, in a sense, as our population as a whole has got healthier and live for longer, it becomes increasingly apparent about where those health inequalities are at their most acute.
I'm going to attempt one final question with
Of course.
Dr. Lisa Cameron. I just simply make the point that the briefer the question, the more possibility there is that she'll get an answer. Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Thank you. Very brief. Do you think it's fair to describe older adults as having made a choice when perhaps it wasn't an informed choice, given the misinformation and lack of evidence at the time that they were making that choice to start to smoke?
I think a lot of people made a choice without having the information in front of them, and I suppose my sort of parting thought to this group is that the consequences of failing to intervene in previous generations are now seen by the older people of today. If this legislation is implemented, that first generation of people won't reach 65 until 2074, but I can tell you that generation of 65-year-olds will look back and would recognise the contribution that a government has made to changing the impact of their long-term health, in the same way as this generation has looked back on the contribution of other governments in other health initiatives. Thank you.
Thank the witness for his question, for his answers to the questions from members, which was really helpful, because not only did it give us the perspective of those that his organisation represents, but the intergenerational nature of their role in the world. That brings us to the end of the morning session. The committee will meet again at 2 p.m. this afternoon here in the Boothroyd room to continue taking oral evidence. I invite the government whip to move the adjournment.
I beg to move that you do now adjourn.
The question is that the further consideration will the bill be now adjourned. As many of the opinions say aye. To contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order.